I am so excited today to be welcoming Amanda Alvaro and Rachael Segal of Beyond a Ballot. They co-host a Canadian female-focused political news show, and I had the rare distinction, I think, of being, was I the first guy you had on your podcast?
You were.
Am I the only, or have you had men on since?
You really opened the floodgates.
I'm glad I was able to really be quite really make history there on your podcast.
You did.
It's going in our Wikipedia page.
I appreciate that. I was there. You had me on to help explain what was happening with the election cycle down here and the crazy politics that we engage in here in the U.S. And it turns out, as we look north of the border, at least these past few weeks, that you guys are saying, hold my beer, America. We're going to keep things interesting up north. So how are things going? How surprised, before we get into the details here, in terms of what we've been watching unfold here around resignations, the future of the prime minister, the election coming up, how rare is this for Canada, or is it just that you do this pretty infrequently?
This never happens, or I can't, in the 20 years, so we have these majority or minority governments. We're currently in a minority government, which means it's a little bit less stable in the House. So it's not absolutely crazy. But I think the crazy part of this story and this week is just the number of issues compounded to come to this stalemate that we're currently seeing in Ottawa.
I want to get into the details here, but first I want to set the table because among the questions I get from a lot of Americans is like, wait, explain how the system works up there, because we have a very unique system, as we addressed on your podcast, that we're used to and we understand. It's a two-party system, Democrats, Republicans, a presidential system. We directly elect the president. They serve 2 4-year terms. In Canada, you have none of that. And so whether it's Amanda or Rachael, one of you want to kind of take the reins here. Give us, to begin, sort of the Canada Politics 101 to set the table here, and then we can dive into issues like the minority government and beyond that.
Okay, you did this so flawlessly on our podcast, so I'm going to try and reciprocate for you. We don't elect a prime minister in Canada, which is something that people, even Canadians, don't really realize. We have a party system where there's multiple parties, not just two, the Westminster system, and we have the House of Commons in Ottawa, and then we have a second chamber called the Senate. The Senate is appointed, the House is elected. Now, how do you become elected? You run in what we call ridings, which are areas that are broken down by population across the country. So typically,
ridings are like our districts.
Districts, here? Exactly.
Okay.
Similar, yeah. So about 100,000 Canadians live in each riding, and we're seeing now, because of population growth, the number of ridings have grown through every election over the course of the last 3 elections. We're currently sitting at 338 ridings. In the next election, I can't remember how many it'll be, but it'll be more. And so you run first for your nomination to be the candidate in your ridings from whatever party you want to represent. And then once you win that, you become the Conservative, NDP, Green, Bloc candidate, whichever party.
Just to pause you there, those are your various parties. You have the Conservative Party.
Correct.
NDP is a party.
Yes.
Green is a party. And then, of course, the Prime Minister leads the Liberal Party.
Right. And those are the main parties. If you look at a Canadian ballot on any given election, you will have about 25 different parties that are running in different ridings across the country. And not all parties run candidates in all ridings. So typically ones that do really well, like the Conservatives and the Liberals and the NDP, will run a full slate of candidates, but they don't have to. If there's a riding they have no candidate in, they don't have to run somebody. So once you're elected, the party that wins the most number of seats across the country becomes the governing party. They are what's called the government. The party with the second most seats is the opposition. Now, there's 2 formal rules with those parties, one each. The leader of the government is called the prime minister, so the leading minister. The leader of the second party is an official position called the leader of the opposition. And they get, special privileges and special time in the House to ask questions. They lead their caucuses, but the prime minister is merely elected by gaining the most number of seats across the country, not by being elected themselves. They become the leader of the party by being elected by their internal party apparatus.
So Canadians will vote for their minister, and then in the case right now, the Liberals got together. They had the majority, and then amongst themselves, they choose the prime minister.
So previous to going to the election, there was an internal Liberal Party leadership election. Justin Trudeau was elected as leader of the party. Those leaders run for a seat as a member of parliament, just like anybody else. Sometimes they don't even win it, and you'll have a leader that's outside of the House. We're seeing that in British Columbia right now with the Green Party. And Pierre Poilievre, who's the leader of the Conservatives, was elected by the Conservatives many years ago. So anybody that sits is called a member of parliament, an MP.
But do Canadians have an idea, if they decide to vote for one party or the other, who the likely prime minister is going to be?
Definitely.
Yes.
Okay. If you vote Liberal right now, if we were in an election today and you voted Liberal, Justin Trudeau is the leader. He would be the prime minister that you are casting your vote for. But one of the biggest frustrations of Canadians is that you don't get to vote for, if I really don't like Justin Trudeau, it doesn't matter if I vote for my local candidate, my Liberal candidate, it's not necessarily going to mean a win for Justin Trudeau, or I vote for my local Conservative is not going to mean a win for Pierre Poilievre. There's a disconnect. Is that clear?
Also, Rachel, you did such a good job of that, of that summary of Canadian politics.
I'm trying to make it short because I could go on forever.
If people out there are interested in learning more, not confusing. The only question I had was, my assumption is if I vote for my local Liberal candidate and Justin Trudeau is the leader, I don't really have a choice in the matter, right?
Right.
Correct.
Right.
Okay. Like the party has chosen who their leader is going to be.
Yes, but also members of the party choose who the leader is. So if you are a member of the Liberal Party, you could have a voice in who that leader could be, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win or get the leader you want.
All right. So that's the basics here. Justin Trudeau has been the prime minister since 2015. So we're going, on 9 years here. He's been the leader of the Liberal Party since 2013. He happens to be, for those unfamiliar with Canadian history, the son of a prime minister who served 15 years himself as prime minister, the longest running prime minister in modern Canadian history. You've had some kind of going way back that served longer. Justin Trudeau to us, as he kind of pops up in the news in America, the assumption was, he was pretty popular, this young leader, especially during that Obama era. Take me through, Amanda, the Justin Trudeau story from sort of peak popularity and how he got to where he is today.
So when Justin Trudeau was elected leader, as you mentioned, in 2013, he went into that election in 2015 as the third party. So it was very unlikely that he would win that election. But he had an amazing personality for politics. He was an excellent campaigner. His campaign caught fire. The momentum was behind him, and he took that election. And he was a really popular prime minister. He went through that first mandate, did a lot of good things. He elected the first 50-50 cabinet, which we'll probably talk about, 50% women in cabinet. So he was known as the quote unquote feminist prime minister. He was definitely progressive. There were a lot of progressive policies that were put in place. And again, he was really popular. And then he ran 2 successive elections. So 2 majority, 1 minority. And over the course of that time, and it's funny, we've had some Americans on our podcast, and when we asked them about Canadian politics, there wasn't a ton of knowledge, but they certainly knew Trudeau, right? His name is well known internationally. He got a lot of headlines. He was popular on the airwaves. So it wasn't just that he was a popular prime minister. He was also, he also attracted a lot of media attention. His popularity has waned, obviously, especially over the last year. Since COVID, I would say, We saw a decline, as many incumbent governments saw, but we certainly saw a decline in his popularity. And he sits now, 20 points behind the Conservative Party, which is now led by Pierre Poilievre. So in a pretty precarious position heading into what is supposed to be our next federal election, which would be October of 2025, although we'll likely go to the polls before then.
Yeah, I want to talk about that. But you made a point of mentioning that this has been a difficult year plus for incumbents around the world. Here in the U.S., the incumbent Democrats lost the White House. But looking globally, in Japan, in India, in South Korea, they've had their own chaos of late. And then most recently in Germany and in France. Basically, whomever is in office, liberal, conservative, depending, no matter where you are on the spectrum, you've either lost seats or lost power. To what extent is the sort of diminishing popularity of Trudeau just a response to that global trend, and how much of it is kind of Canada specific?
Well, I think that there's a couple. I think that there's a couple of things. I think certainly it's been an international and global trend. I think that there were some policies that became less popular over time. Things that he was elected on that were cornerstone of the platform. Things like the carbon rebate or the carbon tax, depending on who you're asking in Canada, became less and less popular. The Conservative Party got a stronger leader, so they had successive leaders who weren't as popular. So it was harder to go head to head with Trudeau in the polls. They have a stronger leader, a stronger communicator who, took an affordability message as his message. And coming out of COVID, when people were really feeling stretched in their pocketbooks, that message really resonated. And so I think those challenges, it was policy challenges. It was, a 3-term prime minister. So, it feels like a change election. You get that undercurrent in Canada. And I think global factors certainly played a role because people were feeling really, really pinched.
Is there a sense, here in the U.S., Democrats are having their sort of what they're calling postmortems to figure out what went wrong, how they lost the Senate and the House and the White House. And there's a debate happening among liberals and Democrats here that it may, elements of the party that have moved too far to the left for the average American, leaving space in the middle for folks to have a genuine discussion of, well, if I'm independent, where should I go? Maybe I'll give the right a shot here. Is something similar happening in Canada?
Well, because we have this multi-party system, I think there's always a question of where people align. Because in Canada, political parties change. And right now, one of the biggest wild cards in what's happening in Canada currently is the NDP party, led by a guy named Jagmeet Singh, who came in as a very popular leader, has been unable to pick up any steam when it comes to his popularity ever since. They had the Liberals and the NDP had an agreement.
Just to give folks a sense, Americans a sense, on the political spectrum from left to right, where does the NDP fall
NDP
from Liberals to Conservatives?
Sits left. The Liberals sit in the middle, and sometimes more left, sometimes more right, depending on the pulse of the country. And then the Conservatives sit right.
Got it. So from left to right, NDP, Liberal, Conservative.
Yes, but I also want to caveat for the American audience that these are not die-hard, stick in the mud, like we're not moving. We are right wing. It changes based on leaders, based on parties, based on issues. So the Conservative Party under our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, is very different from the Conservative Party of Canada that you see today. The Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau is very different from the Liberal Party of his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And that's really based on issues and taking positions that craft where your party is sitting at that time in history.
Understood. So as far as politics is concerned, though, and kind of people's viewpoints, is there a feeling that the Liberal Party of Justin Trudeau is sitting square in the middle of where Canada is, to the left of where the average Canadian is? And is that one of the reasons why the Conservatives seem to have more space here?
I think that is a reason why the Conservatives have more space. I think that Jagmeet Singh, as I was saying, has been so low in the polls for so long that the Liberals saw that center-left position as an open field for them, ripe for the picking, to come out and put policies on the table that would attract a more socialized audience of Canadians that want public health care, that want dental care, which is a big issue that we're talking about here. The agreement that I just brought up. So they're in a minority government, I said earlier, meaning that they don't have enough seats to stay in government on a vote without an opposition party lending them their seats. So over the last couple of years, Jagmeet Singh of the NDP and Justin Trudeau have had an agreement that if there's a confidence vote, if the government is in question, if they are about to fall, the NDP will vote in support of whatever that is in order to keep them in power. In September, and your listeners can go and Google this video, Jagmeet Singh did a very dramatic video of him standing in Ottawa, ripping up a piece of paper saying, "We are done with this agreement. We will take down this government." Since then, he's had 8 opportunities to take down the government, but he hasn't. He's voted with them on all of it. With that said, he has put forward policy issues over the last few years, dental care being one of them, pharmacare being another, big national expensive policies that Canadians that typically vote NDP are very in favor of. And Justin Trudeau has actually pushed those forward in return for this support, for this electoral support. And so it's a bit of a mess, but I would say the Liberals about a year ago bet on that left-leaning vote. Ultimately, I'm not sure how much of it they've picked up.
Are you guys able to answer? Do you have a sense of how similar or different Canadian Conservatives, the Canadian Conservative Party, is to the American Republican Party? Just for folks to be able to grasp that. And then same thing about the Canadian Liberal Party to the American Democratic Party.
I think we both have partisan answers on that one.
Yes.
I'm going to say, as a conservative in Canada, that we are very different from the Republicans. I think there are factions of the Conservative Party of Canada that would align on some of those Republican issues, social issues. But the majority of Canadians, I think, that identify themselves as conservatives would say that they are more center right. And Canada as a nation is generally more progressive than the United States. So on some of those social questions, I don't think there's as much alignment with the Republicans. Probably on the economic stuff, we would align most commonly. But there's a big political move here on behalf of the Liberals to try and, in advance of the next election, equate Pierre Poilievre to Donald Trump for Canadians. And that hasn't really stuck up here. So I think most Canadians reject that alignment with Republicans.
Got it. And then as far as the U.S. Democratic Party and the Canadian Liberal Party, relatively similar?
Yeah, I would say that there's quite a bit of similarity. I think that where you see the similarity on the conservative side, and you see it in conservatism across the globe, is this kind of populist rhetoric. And that has really been adopted in Canada by the current conservative leaders. So that's where we see some of those parallels. And the Liberals have used that to sort of create this idea that, there's this Trump-like nature to him, because Trump's not very popular in Canada. And so when Liberals are trying to gain favor, they often make that comparison between our conservative leaders and Trump. But I would see more parallels between the Liberals and the Democrats for sure. But again, it's the entire nation. I would agree with Rachael, is a much more sort of centrist, even more progressive, I would say, than anything we see in the U.S.
And for your audience, there was a poll done in Canada right before the U.S. election of how many conservatives would vote for Donald Trump. 75% would not have. Okay.
So they're about... because internally in the Republican Party, as the Republican Party was having its primaries here in the U.S., is you polled them, it was sort of like a 50-50, but then grew over time to be like 75% of Republicans supported Donald Trump. So the complete contrast there.
Exactly.
But I mean, we should note, Canada's a place where you guys have a universal publicly funded healthcare system. People who propose that in the U.S., even the Democratic Party, are a minority, like the Bernie Sanders of the world.
Right.
And so since, Trump is part of the discussion here, brought him up a few times, and he's been central to the discussion here, and wondering how much of when Trump tweeted out a couple weeks ago that he was going to unleash tariffs on Canada, How much of that was the ball rolling here on sort of instability in Canadian politics, and he sort of just kind of threw a match on it? To what extent is this revolving around Trump's election, the tariff call, some of the other matters, or how much of this was inevitable given that you guys were going into an election year anyway?
I think a lot of it was inevitable. I mean, we as liberals often talked about the fact that if Trump was elected, which he has been, what would that do to Canadian politics? Would that change the course? Would that change the trajectory? And I think that many liberals or many progressives in Canada were hoping that his election would change our fortunes here. And I don't think, at least to date, and maybe inauguration will change that, but we haven't seen that shift yet. When the tariff tweets went out, did it add fuel to the fire? Of course it did. I mean, the entire country, but in some ways, it also really brought the country together. Each of our provinces, like your states, is led by a premier. And each of those premiers come from different political stripes. So there's some conservative premiers, there are some liberal premiers, there's an NDP premier. We really brought the country together in a much more united front to say, if we have one common enemy, it's this idea of 20% tariffs that could really wreak havoc on our economy. And that was the first time, I would say, in what has felt like a really fractured, really divided country, that in the last few weeks, while all of this chaos has ensued, it has in many ways brought a lot of our leaders together to say, we have this fight to fight and we have to go shoulder to shoulder on it.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about trade here and tariffs, nearly $1 trillion goes back and forth between Canada and the U.S. every year. And so I know that, even the threat here, even though it's sort of minimized by folks on Wall Street, this is a negotiation tactic, but Donald Trump here, real life ramifications for businesses, both here and in Canada. But I understand that there's been sort of a divide on how to handle it. Trudeau made a quick visit down to Mar-a-Lago for dinner, took a smiley photo saying, great to be working with Donald Trump. I think we can work together here. I know with the resignations that in particular, the Freeland resignation, the deputy prime minister in the last week, there was a question of how to handle Donald Trump and the tariff threat. Can you lay out sort of how are the various parties thinking about working with Trump here in a second term on the tariff issue and other issues?
Well, like Amanda said, I think right now the interesting thing is this divide between the responsibility of the federal government versus the responsibility of our provinces. So you guys have, your state level decisions and then your federal decisions. For us, it's the same. It's always this question of the power struggle. And all of our provinces each have a touch point with the United States. Like we have a border, and border security is a big issue that's on the table. So like Amanda said, this has been an all hands on deck. We're calling it the all Canada, Team Canada approach is what the federal government is framing this as. But you're right. There have been some outliers when it comes to the unity amongst the premiers. So in Alberta, we have Danielle Smith, who is a very conservative premier. And she has gone ahead and said, we are putting forward these measures. We are going to pass these bills for border security. We are going to show Trump that we are serious about this. Another conservative premier in Ontario, Doug Ford, who's very, very dependent on the auto sector, manufacturing. I mean, that's the heartbeat of our economy in Canada, is based in Ontario. He has gone hard on his PR campaign. He's been on Fox News. He spent millions of dollars on ads to play on American television. And he's really been the one encouraging other premiers to do the same. By contrast, people like my premier here in British Columbia, David Eby, who's an NDP premier, has really sat back and said, we're going to wait and see what the federal response is, what the premiers are doing, while at the same time holding a province which has our forestry industry, fishing, mining, like these massive industries that are the backbone of the Canadian economy. And so ultimately, we had to step back this week because they were all meeting, all the premiers in Toronto this week, while Justin Trudeau was embroiled in all of this controversy in Ottawa, and really took the air out of that all Canada approach that was going on in Toronto and the strategy that came out of that, we really didn't hear much of what the premiers ended their meeting on or what their plan is, because it's all, the air's been taken out by all of the drama that's ensuing with the future of the Liberal Party.
Well, I mean, Trump keeps saying that the U.S. is subsidizing Canada to the tune of $100 billion a year. Is there a sense, what is he talking about there? What is he accusing Canada of doing? And it does sound like, though, based on some of the responses that you've just been laying out, that sort of he's gotten a bit of what he wanted, which was, I'm going to threaten tariffs and force Canada to change some of their policies to my liking.
Big message up here is that we have to take this seriously. And we've never had a leader that governed through X, or what's the other one? Truth Social. We don't know how to operate in that way. We're like this nice little country up north. Like we got some premiers.
Right,
we all talk to each other.
You follow traditional rules and procedures and communication mechanisms, etc.
Totally.
Yeah. But the big message that has come out of both the federal and all provincial governments is that this is going to happen, and we have to operate like this is going to happen. And regardless of the medium, we have to take the message seriously. And so Trump makes points that are vast generalizations, and there's some truth to them. I mean, he says that he's been subsidizing Canada because of the amount of trade that we do, and the fact that there are no tariffs and job creation and things like that. So sure, okay. But at the end of the day, the one thing that he discredits is just the role that Canada plays in the United States as well. I mean, you guys need energy. You guys need water. We supply those things. British Columbia, my province, supplies a lot of water to the state of California, and a lot of energy to the state of California, which is dependent on Canadian minerals and resources. So it's a weird game to be playing, but I do want to say to your listeners, like, we as a country are taking it very, very seriously. And it's cute to call us the 51st state, but ultimately, and Trudeau, as a conservative up here, calling him the governor, I thought that was very cute. But
yeah, so Trump has been, I guess it started as a joke that leaked out of a meeting, but now he's like very aggressive with the trolling, the memes, joking. How is that playing there? Because here in the U.S., we're like, oh, he's like making a joke about Canada, but it's like, well, how do the millions of people in Canada feel about being referred to as, you just become a state, like the 51st state? Or maybe two states. He's proposed a Western Canadian conservative state and an Eastern Canadian liberal state. From the vantage point of Mar-a-Lago.
I think Canadians are probably feeling the way that Americans would feel if Canada suggested that the U.S. could become the 14th province or territory. Right? Like it was maybe funny the first time around. Now it's just completely insulting and offensive. Here's the thing. Canada, though, while taking it seriously, is also not a lame duck. If you look 6 years ago, Trump slapped, and it's not the first time dealing with Trump, right?
Yeah.
6 years ago, Trump slapped 10% tariffs on aluminum and steel. And Canada responded in kind with $16 billion matching dollar for dollar tariffs on American exports. So those, and what ended up happening? What ended up happening was that they both dropped those tariffs because it wasn't mutually beneficial. We have an ecosystem that is mutually beneficial. And I think the Team Canada approach is about going to the U.S. not just to convince officials, but to convince consumers how critical it is that this relationship is symbiotic. Because it is. Oil, minerals, metals, energy. There are critical elements. And Canada is the biggest export, right? Bigger than China, Japan, France, and the UK combined. So part of the effort is really a PR effort. And we know that when Trump tweets, or whatever you call it over Truth Social now, I guess you can't call it a tweet. The truths. Yes. Oh, that's so horrifying. But when he does what he does, it's a negotiating tactic. He starts his negotiation far in advance as a destabilizing effort, right? To pump chaos into, and to distract really from the negotiations that will and need to take place. But those negotiations are underway. Canadian officials are talking to American officials, and there's a lot of strong relationships there that we'll rely on to get this done.
And so is there a sense, an optimistic sense, that the tariff will not happen, that they'll be able to?
No.
No.
No, I think that there's a sense that it will happen. I think that right now Canada is considering what the response will be, and if they're able to, sort of harness how large that tariff could be, what our response would be in kind to the critical things that we supply to the U.S., and hopefully that PR campaign and that effort between officials will result in the tariffs being removed. But I don't think that there's any Canadian official right now who thinks that Trump is bluffing.
Can I also say that I want to put in perspective for your listeners. I've said the word tariff probably more in the last month than ever in my life. And Amanda and I are both commentators in Canada, so we do a lot of media. Tariff is always the topic. In the last 4 days, I haven't said tariff once. And so the dial has been turned when it comes to the Canadian narrative on what's happening. It's, okay, this is the disaster that's happening in our parliament right now. Oh, yeah. And how does Trump coming in on January 20th and imposing these tariffs impact whether or not this prime minister is going to carry on?
Right. My understanding is there could be a no confidence vote at some point in late January, right?
So the House will come back in late January. So the first opportunity for a confidence vote is actually March 14th. So they get scheduled. Basically, every opposition party gets the ability to put a bill on the table that will count as a no confidence vote. The next opportunity is the Conservative Party, which will have an opportunity to table a non-confidence vote on February 27th. The House then goes on break for 2 weeks, and they come back March 14th to vote on whatever bill that they table, which obviously is going to be a confidence vote. But will we come back? We don't even know. There's so many question marks, even at this point, as we sit here today, on whether or not the prime minister will stay, whether or not we will prorogue, which means to basically press a pause button on Canadian Parliament, meaning that they can't table anything, nothing. They don't go back to Ottawa. And we've seen prime ministers previously use prorogation in times of crises to kind of stop and pause. Stephen Harper did it in 2008.
Which is basically canceling Parliament, saying, head home until I call you back.
Correct. Well, the Governor General would have to approve a request for prorogation. And Stephen Harper did it, like I said, in 2008. The Governor General really took 3 hours to question him on why he wanted this. And so he has to go and make a case to the Governor General. If they approve it, then it's a pause button, meaning that they can come back. The same legislation that was on the table will come back with them, as opposed to when they rise for an election and then everything's canceled. But it's like a pause button to give a little breathing room to the government.
I think Trump would like a pause button on Congress, but let's not give him any ideas. So when it comes to elections here in the U.S., it's in the Constitution. We have it the first Tuesday of November every 4 years. That's not how it works in your world. So there is a deadline to have an election by the fall, but like it could happen at any moment. Is that what we can expect next year?
It could happen if they were to fall on a confidence motion. So it could happen before October.
So confidence motion is basically everyone takes a vote. Do we have confidence in the prime minister?
Exactly.
Is it a simple majority or 2/3?
Yes.
A majority, simple majority.
Simple majority votes, no confidence. You immediately, now we're off to elections.
Correct. But there's only certain situations where a confidence vote can be tabled. They can't just walk in and say, okay, this is going to be a confidence vote. For example, public safety bills, national security bills, and money bills are automatically confidence votes, meaning the budget every year, that's an automatic confidence vote. A confidence vote can be tabled by the opposition on the days where they have been given the ability to table a bill. So that's what I'm saying. The next time for an opposition party to table a bill will be at the end of February. The other alternative, and we saw this during that whole situation, the prime minister invoked the Emergencies Act, and they ended up the opposition pushed the government to make the decision whether or not to enact that a confidence vote. The government itself, outside of those times where the opposition has the ability to table a confidence vote, has to be the one to say, this is a confidence vote. So they could have made any bill a confidence vote, but they've chosen not to. to this point. If they come back in January and they decide that they want to go to an election, they could make anything a confidence vote. And we heard that now the NDP is saying they will not vote in support of the government on the next confidence vote or in the next sitting. We're not sure when. But I want to just really reference the instability that is occurring in our government right now is kind of unprecedented. There's so many outcomes to what's going on. And one of them could be we simply keep going until whenever the House falls. And that's a very reasonable outcome. Another one is that we go to pause, we prorogue, and the Liberals do a leadership race. The Prime Minister steps down. The question is, how does that play with Donald Trump coming in January 20th? And then other alternatives are, the government falls on the budget in April, and we go to the polls. But the deadline is October of 2024, October 21st, 2025. We're almost in 2025, is the deadline for that election to happen. And that was only recently brought in by Stephen Harper. We had no election dates until he brought that in 2008. And now it's every 4 years unless the government falls.
Got it. All right. So no matter what, there will be an election next year in Canada.
2025.
Yes, there will be an election.
October. And I imagine one of the arguments Trudeau is probably going to make is, listen, I was prime minister the first time Trump was in power. This is an important relationship. There's a lot of major issues. You need me to be in power this time. Is that not an argument he will make?
I don't think so.
No.
Well, I do. I think to a certain extent he will. I think that, how January go. Right now, the decision that we're all looking at is whether or not he will resign. And, that will change everything, because obviously then the Liberal Party would have to go to a leadership race. We'd have to elect a new leader. That leader would run in the next election. And the relationship of the Liberal Party may then not be the argument that you want to make about, how a number of years ago we were able to come to trade deals with the U.S. I think that everything that's happening now over the next few weeks will decide the kind of argument that they'll make as it relates to Trump and as it relates to that relationship. But there is a relationship there. There's a relationship that exists between, the Trump administration and members of that administration previously. And I think that relationship is real and effective and can be effective. But there is obviously a lot of variables because he has so much more power this time around, or at least that's the perception in Canada. And I think that power and the way that he's wielding it even now before Inauguration Day is somewhat concerning, because it's not just power, it's also volatility. And those things are destabilizing.
Tell me about opposition leader Pierre Poilievre. What's his story? What are things that he's promising for Canada? And what's his relationship like with Donald Trump?
You want to take that one, Amanda?
Well, I think you should take that one because he's your guy.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give a very biased opinion, but I think he's great. Pierre Poilievre is somebody that knows Ottawa better than most people. He was a young staffer in Ottawa for Stephen Harper, before Stephen Harper was even the prime minister, when he was just a member of parliament. And he's continued on in Ottawa, being elected in an Ottawa riding for many years. He's been there, I think, since 2008, maybe 6, sometime around there.
Like he hasn't had a job outside of politics,
which
is a Liberal Party talking point. Okay,
but also true.
But also true.
But we should mention, like Harper was the last Conservative Prime Minister of Canada, so
and only. Like in recent modern history, there has not been. He was really the turning point for the Conservative movement in Canada. When two Conservative parties came together, he became the leader of that party and then governed for 9 years, which was something we hadn't seen in modern history. So he's kind of like the godfather of the Conservative movement at this point in Canada. Pierre Poilievre is whip smart. He knows policy better than most people in that place. And he sat in Stephen Harper's cabinet. There was rumblings for a long time that he would run for the leadership of the Conservative Party. He actually announced he would run and then pulled out a couple of leadership races ago because I think he was waiting for his time. He got in on a first ballot for leadership, which doesn't ever happen. We have there's sometimes 10, 12 people that will run for a party leadership, and he just won it right off the bat.
So super popular within the party.
Very popular, and the momentum's been building. He's currently sitting about 20 points ahead of the Liberals. This has never happened before in Canada. In polling and sitting and staying there. And that is never been the case before.
What's motivating the voters right now? What are the issues that are most kind of dictating the reason why Conservatives have such a lead in the polls?
Affordability.
So the inflation issue, the cost of living, is similar challenges to what you've been seeing.
Cost of living, housing, those would be big issues that are concerning Canadians for sure. One note about Poilievre, though, that I think is interesting is that the party is ahead, but his own popularity is not that high. So it's neutral. So I think, he's had a pretty strong trajectory. Again, he's an excellent communicator and he's done a really good job with communication, but his own popularity kind of levels out as his party's popularity has grown.
And communication is really tied to a lot of the policy messaging out of the Conservative Party. So the big slogan in Canada right now is "Axe the tax," which is in reference to the carbon tax. He's got like 3 or 4 slogans that his entire team just repeat constantly.
Wait, explain the carbon tax. What's that policy?
Amanda, your policy? You go.
Well, it's really a revenue neutral policy, which it's so sad because it was a policy that actually was part of the last election, implemented in provinces across the country, so implemented federally. And the idea of it was a rebate system. So you would pay more at the pumps, you would then get a rebate, which would cover what you're paying. The Conservatives really effectively labeled it a tax. So the rebate portion of it, the fact that you get a check back, has been utterly lost in communication. And the popularity of that policy has cratered over the course of the last year. So the sloganization of the party is very much, it's like that is brand Conservative right now. There's a lot of slogans, and "Axe the tax" has to be the biggest one.
So it's a clean energy policy that's trying to...
and the Conservatives are rightfully claiming that it's just increasing the affordability crisis. So like anything that we bring in, there's a tax on the fuel of the truck that item comes in on. When you go to the pump, we pay, 21 cents in British Columbia on top of our high gas prices for this carbon tax. And every province, like I was talking about before, is different when it comes to the carbon tax. So in British Columbia, we don't get it back. Because our premier has decided not to use the federal system. And so the experience of every Canadian with regards to this carbon tax is very different. But one thing that Canadians are coming together on is the fact that we're in an affordability crisis. And at this moment in time, a carbon tax is just making things worse. As
we talk about Trudeau and his unclear future, are there some names we should be on the lookout for as sort of the next potential Liberal leader, and what's something we should know about them?
Yeah, I think that there are some names for sure. You've probably heard this week that our now former finance minister, the first female finance minister in Canada, Chrystia Freeland, resigned. She was also the deputy prime minister.
Former journalist. I used to put her on Bloomberg TV.
Really?
Former journalist. I co-chaired her nomination campaign, so I'm a big Chrystia Freeland fan. There's a lot of parallels happening in Canada right now where people are like, this is like a Biden-Kamala scenario, right? She resigned her position. If
Kamala had resigned to try to get Biden out.
If Kamala had resigned to try to, yes.
Yes.
But, is there a woman in the wings waiting to take on the party? There's a lot of speculation that she will run for leader. There's other names that you might want to pay attention to. Melanie Joly, there was a big New York Times profile on her. That's very unusual for Canadian politicians. She's one to watch. Minister Champagne, he is one to watch from Quebec. And a name that you may or may not have heard of, Mark Carney. I think probably the biggest speculation around him running for the leader. He is not currently an elected member of Parliament. So this would be somebody coming in from the outside. There's been a lot of courting for him to be part of the party, to be part of the government. And I think that there's a lot of momentum behind his name right now.
Yeah, he'd be like us electing a former Fed chair, like Federal
Right.
Reserve
Yes.
chair,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
be president, right? He ran the Bank of Canada.
He ran the Bank of Canada.
And one more name I'll add to that is former BC Premier Christy Clark, who was a BC Liberal Premier. Everyone thought she was more on the conservative side. She's now come out and announced that she is a federal Liberal. And through all the drama that we've been seeing in Ottawa this week, she has been posting all kinds of pictures of her with federal Liberals and really gearing up to make a run for the Liberal leadership whenever that happens.
So as Americans watch what's unfolding up north, it sounds like there's going to be the response to the tariffs, which is going to be, significant. Amanda, you mentioned, last time around, you launched your own tariffs against us. And then everyone said, okay, let's put away our tariff guns.
We'd rather be friends than foes, right?
Right. You're our closest ally. Literally, you're on the border. We share a very long border together.
Yes, we do. Happy border.
And as we watch just sort of this chaos unfold, right? Resignations. The bottom line is this: it sounds like no matter what, there will be an election in 2025. It's just going to potentially be a pretty messy 2025 for Canada before then.
Yes, I think that's
Messy,
that's probably an accurate description.
Messy by Canadian standards.
Messy by Canadian standards, which could still be considered quite polite, actually.
Sorry for our mess. Yes.
Totally.
I think the bigger question that Americans should also wonder about is who will be running for prime minister. Will it be Justin Trudeau?
Yes.
Will there be a Liberal leadership race? And in the context of the US, like who's going to be the one talking to Donald Trump as leader of your closest ally? I think is an interesting question that we're going to have to wait and find out.
Well, we have a good Canadian audience, Mo News. They're very excited. They're like, "Oh, you're finally covering what's happening up here." I was like, "Well, you make enough noise up there,
Right?
Eventually, we'll hear you down here."
Yeah, we're waving our flag, saying, "Look at us!
Look at us! Look at us! We can have messy politics too.
We can be exciting too."
Well, I appreciate the 101, the tutorial here. We'll check in again as all of this unfolds. And wishing you guys a great holiday break, if you get a break amid all this news.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.